The prince promised me everything except the one thing my heart needed most. Those were the words I remembered on the night my world quietly changed forever. My name is Elliot Parker, and for years I believed that standing beside the Alpha Prince meant I had finally found where I belonged. I never dreamed that the person I trusted most would be the one to make me feel like I was never truly chosen. In the kingdom of Aurelia, traditions shaped every part of life. The royal family valued responsibility, reputation, and the expectations carried by those born into power. As the future ruler, Nathaniel Brooks had been raised to believe that every decision he made had to protect the crown before anything else. He was admired by the people, respected by the royal council, and known as an alpha who carried himself with confidence. But behind the image of the perfect prince was a man who struggled with emotions he never learned how to express. I had known Nathaniel long before the world saw him as a future king. I knew the quiet moments when he would leave the grand halls of the palace just to find a peaceful place away from endless responsibilities. I knew the thoughtful person hidden behind his formal words and royal appearance. For a long time, I believed that knowing the real Nathaniel was enough. I believed that someday he would look at me and realize that I was not just someone standing beside him. I was someone who truly understood him. But I was wrong. The day everything changed began inside the royal garden, beneath the old silver trees that had watched generations of the royal family make important choices. Nathaniel stood across from me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not anger. It was not cruelty. It was uncertainty. "Elliot, you know what my position requires," he said quietly. "There are things I cannot choose simply because my heart wants them." I already knew what he was trying to say, but hearing the words still felt different. The person I loved was choosing duty over the bond we shared. He told me that he could not give me his mark. He told me that the future of the kingdom required careful decisions. He told me that it was not about my worth, but sometimes the most painful words are the ones spoken gently. Because even when someone says you are valuable, their actions can still make you feel invisible. I smiled because I did not want him to see how deeply those words affected me. I told him I understood. I told him I respected his decision. But inside, I realized something important. Love should never feel like waiting for someone to finally decide you matter. That evening, I returned to the room I had shared with countless memories of Nathaniel. The palace was still beautiful. The halls were still filled with music and light. Everything looked exactly the same. Yet somehow, everything felt different. For the first time, I wondered if the place I had called home was only a place where I had been hoping to belong. And as I looked at the life I had built around someone else's choice, I made a decision that would change both of our futures. If the prince could not choose me, then I would finally choose myself. The hardest goodbyes are not the ones filled with anger. They are the quiet ones where two people still care about each other, but one of them finally understands that love alone cannot make a place feel like home. After my conversation with Nathaniel, I spent the entire night walking through the halls of Aurelia Palace, memorizing every corner that had once felt familiar. The paintings on the walls, the endless marble corridors, and the soft lights from the royal chambers all carried memories of the time I believed I had a future there. But memories could not replace the feeling of being chosen. The next morning, I made my decision. I would leave before my heart became a permanent guest in a place where it was never truly welcomed. I did not write a dramatic letter. I did not ask Nathaniel to reconsider. I did not try to convince him that what we had was worth protecting. I simply left a short message expressing my gratitude for the kindness he had shown me and my hope that he would find the future he wanted. Then I packed the few belongings that truly belonged to me and walked away from the palace. Outside the gates of Aurelia, the world felt unfamiliar, but it also felt strangely peaceful. For the first time in years, every choice I made belonged completely to me. I was no longer waiting for a prince to decide if I was important enough to stand beside him. I was learning how to stand on my own. Nathaniel did not realize I had left immediately. He spent that morning preparing for another meeting with the royal council, believing that life would continue as it always had. He believed that the distance between us was temporary. He believed I would eventually understand his decision in return when emotions had settled. But he did not know that some moments change a person forever. When he finally entered the room where we had spent so many quiet evenings together, he noticed the difference immediately. The space was clean and orderly, but something was missing. The small details that had made the room feel alive were gone. The books I always kept near the window had disappeared. The flowers I cared for were no longer there. The quiet presence he had grown used to was gone. Nathaniel stood there for a long moment, realizing that the room had never truly been empty before. He had simply never noticed how much warmth another person could bring into his life. Later that day, he searched for me, expecting to find me somewhere in the palace. But every answer he received carried the same message. Elliot had left Aurelia. At first, Nathaniel told himself that this was only a temporary choice. He believed I would return after some time apart. But as the days passed, he began to understand the difference between someone leaving and someone finally letting go. Meanwhile, I arrived in a small, coastal town several hours away from the capital. The ocean breeze, the quiet streets, and the simple rhythm of everyday life gave me something I had forgotten existed: peace. I started building a new life, not as someone connected to a prince, but as Elliot Parker. For the first time, I was discovering who I was when I was not waiting for someone else's approval. And while Nathaniel remained inside the palace that once represented everything he wanted, he slowly began to realize that the person he thought would always stay was the person he had never truly learned how to keep. For the first time in many years, Nathaniel Brooks discovered that silence could feel heavier than any responsibility placed upon his shoulders. The halls of Aurelia Palace remained as grand as ever. The royal meetings continued, and the kingdom moved forward as it always had. Yet something important had changed. The person who once filled the quiet spaces of his life was no longer there. At first, Nathaniel tried to convince himself that Elliot Parker only needed time. He believed that once emotions settled, Elliot would understand why the decision had been necessary. After all, Nathaniel had spent his entire life learning that a future ruler must place duty above personal desires. But as the days passed, he began noticing all the small things he had never truly appreciated. The morning tea that always appeared before his meetings was no longer waiting on the table. The thoughtful notes that reminded him to rest were gone. The quiet conversations that helped him escape the pressure of the crown had disappeared. Nathaniel realized that Elliot had never simply been someone standing beside him. Elliot had been the person who made the palace feel less like a place of responsibility and more like a place he could call home. Meanwhile, far away from the capital, Elliot was learning a different kind of happiness. The coastal town was smaller than Aurelia, but offered a peaceful rhythm that allowed him to breathe. He rented a modest studio near the ocean, filled with sunlight, books, and the creative projects he had always wanted to pursue. There were no expectations placed on him, no royal traditions to follow, no need to wonder if he was enough for someone else. For the first time, Elliot was building a life based on his own choices. He still remembered Nathaniel. He still cared about him. Leaving had never been about ending those feelings. It was about understanding that love should not require someone to constantly prove their worth. One afternoon, while organizing old books in his studio, Elliot found a small memory from his time at the palace. He held it for a moment, allowing himself to remember the good times without allowing the past to control his future. He smiled softly because he finally understood that those memories were part of his story, but they did not define who he was. Back in Aurelia, Nathaniel began questioning everything he once believed. During a meeting with the royal council, he found himself unable to focus on discussions about future plans. His thoughts kept returning to the same realization. He had protected the image of a perfect prince, but in doing so, he had failed to protect the person who mattered most. One evening, Nathaniel entered the room where Elliot had once stayed. The space was quiet, untouched, and colder than he remembered. He stood near the window and looked outside, remembering all the moments when Elliot had been there, patiently waiting for him to understand. For the first time, Nathaniel admitted a truth he had avoided for too long. He had not lost Elliot because circumstances forced them apart. He had lost him because he believed Elliot would always remain available. That realization changed everything. Nathaniel finally understood that some people do not leave because they stop caring. Sometimes they leave because they have learned they deserve to be chosen. And now, for the first time, the Alpha Prince wanted to know if he still had a chance to become the person Elliot once hoped he could be. The distance between Aurelia Palace and the coastal town was measured in miles, but for Nathaniel Brooks, it felt much greater. For the first time in his life, the Alpha Prince understood that some distances could not be crossed by status, promises, or authority. If he wanted to find Elliot Parker again, he would have to approach him not as a prince, but as the person who had once taken his presence for granted. Before leaving the capital, Nathaniel spent time reflecting on every moment he had ignored. He remembered the conversations where Elliot tried to share his hopes, the quiet evenings when Elliot waited for him to finish royal duties, and the countless times Elliot offered support without asking for anything in return. Nathaniel had mistaken that patience for certainty. He believed Elliot would always be there because Elliot had always been there. Now he understood that patience was not endless, and love was not something anyone should be expected to give without feeling valued. When Nathaniel finally arrived in the coastal town, he was surprised by how peaceful Elliot's new life appeared. There were no palace walls, no royal guards, and no formal ceremonies. Instead, there were simple streets, ocean waves, and people who knew Elliot not because of his connection to the crown, but because of who he truly was. Nathaniel saw Elliot helping others, sharing ideas, and living with a confidence he had never seen before. It was a version of Elliot that existed beyond the palace, and Nathaniel realized he had only known part of the person he loved. When Elliot noticed Nathaniel standing nearby, the moment between them was quiet. There was no dramatic confrontation, no anger, and no need for harsh words. They simply looked at each other, two people carrying memories of a past that had changed them both. "Why are you here?" Elliot asked softly. Nathaniel took a breath before answering. In the past, he would have searched for the perfect royal response. He would have explained his responsibilities and defended his choices. But this time he chose honesty. "Because I finally understand what I lost," he said. Elliot looked away for a moment. Understanding something after losing it does not erase what happened. Nathaniel nodded because he knew Elliot was right. He had not come expecting forgiveness. He had not come believing that one conversation could repair everything. He had come because Elliot deserved to know that the person who once failed to choose him had finally learned why that choice mattered. Over the following days, Nathaniel stayed in the coastal town longer than anyone at the palace expected. He did not ask Elliot to return. He did not use his title to influence him. Instead, he learned about Elliot's new life and allowed himself to see the world from a different perspective. He discovered that Elliot had created something meaningful without the support of the royal family. He discovered that the person he once thought needed him had actually become stronger without him. That realization was both painful and inspiring. Elliot noticed the difference too. Nathaniel was no longer trying to control the outcome. He was simply present. For the first time, Elliot saw the possibility that the prince before him was not trying to reclaim the past. He was trying to become someone worthy of a future. And while Elliot was not ready to return to the life they once shared, he began to wonder if the person who had left him behind had finally learned how to walk beside him. The days Nathaniel Brooks spent in the coastal town changed him in ways he never expected. When he first arrived, he believed he needed to find the right words to explain himself to Elliot Parker. He thought an apology could somehow carry the weight of every moment when he had failed to see what was right in front of him. But as time passed, Nathaniel realized that words alone were not enough. The person he had hurt did not need another promise. He needed to see a different person standing before him. For the first time, Nathaniel stopped trying to fix everything quickly. He allowed himself to experience the simple moments he had once overlooked. He walked along the shoreline with Elliot, listened to stories about the people Elliot had met, and learned about the dreams he had created away from Aurelia Palace. Nathaniel discovered that Elliot had built a life filled with purpose, kindness, and independence. He was no longer the Omega waiting for recognition from a prince. He was someone who knew his own value. That realization was difficult for Nathaniel, but it was also important. He finally understood that Elliot had never needed a crown or a royal promise. He had only wanted to feel chosen by the person he loved. One evening, The two of them sat near the ocean as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon. The peaceful sound of the waves filled the silence between them. Nathaniel looked toward the water before speaking. "I used to think that protecting my future meant making difficult choices," he said. "But I never considered that some choices could cost me the person who made that future meaningful." Elliot listened quietly. He had imagined this moment many times before, but the reality felt different. Nathaniel was not asking him to forget. He was not asking him to return simply because he missed what they had. He was finally acknowledging the pain he had caused. "You know what hurt the most?" Elliot asked. "It was not that you were afraid. It was that you made the decision without allowing me to be part of it." Nathaniel lowered his gaze because he knew those words were true. He had spent years believing that carrying responsibility alone was a sign of strength. Now he understood that shutting someone out was not protection. It was a distance he created between himself and the person who cared for him most. "I cannot change what happened," Nathaniel said, "but I can change who I become after it." Elliot looked at him carefully. The difference was clear. The prince who once stood before him with certainty now stood with humility. There was no demand in his voice, no expectation, only honesty. As the weeks continued, Nathaniel became part of the coastal community. People who once knew him only as a royal figure began seeing the person beneath the title. Elliot noticed that Nathaniel treated everyone with the same respect, whether they held influence or not. It reminded him of the person he had always believed Nathaniel could become. Slowly, the walls between them began to soften, not because the past disappeared, but because the future no longer felt impossible. Elliot still carried the memories of being left behind. Nathaniel still carried the regret of causing that pain. But now they were facing those feelings together instead of allowing them to separate them. And for the first time since leaving Aurelia Palace, Elliot wondered if the prince who once refused to choose him was finally learning what it meant to choose someone with his whole heart. The relationship between Nathaniel Brooks and Elliot Parker was no longer defined by the choices that had separated them. Instead, it was being rebuilt through the small moments that proved change was real. Nathaniel had once believed that a single decision could protect his future, but now he understood that every decision shaped the people around him. He had spent so much time preparing to become a great ruler that he forgot the importance of becoming a better person first. In the coastal town, away from the expectations of Aurelia Palace, Nathaniel began discovering a different way to live. He no longer measured his worth by his title or the approval of the royal council. He learned to appreciate quiet mornings, simple conversations, and the feeling of being known without needing to perform a role. Elliot noticed these changes, but he remained careful. His heart still remembered the moment when Nathaniel chose the crown before him. Forgiveness was possible, but trust needed time. Nathaniel respected that. He did not try to rush Elliot or convince him that everything could return to the way it was before. He understood that the past could not simply be erased. One afternoon, while walking through the town market, Nathaniel saw Elliot speaking with local residents. People greeted Elliot warmly, not because of any connection to royalty, but because they respected his kindness and dedication. Nathaniel felt a quiet admiration as he watched him. He realized that Elliot had built a meaningful life without needing anyone's permission. The person he had once underestimated was someone with a strength he had never fully understood. Later that evening, Nathaniel and Elliot sat outside Elliot's studio, watching the stars appear above the ocean. The conversation between them was calm, but the emotions behind it were deep. "I spent so much time thinking I had to protect my position," Nathaniel admitted. "I never realized that I was protecting myself from the possibility of being truly understood." Elliot looked at him thoughtfully. "And what do you think now?" Nathaniel took a moment before answering. "Now, I think the people who know us best are not weaknesses. They're the ones who remind us who we are when we forget." Those words stayed with Elliot because they showed a level of honesty he had never received from Nathaniel before. The prince was no longer speaking like someone trying to regain something he lost. He was speaking like someone who finally understood the value of what he had. Meanwhile, back in Aurelia, the royal council began questioning Nathaniel's extended absence. Some believed that a future king should focus only on tradition and duty. But Nathaniel returned to the palace with a clearer understanding of his responsibilities. He knew being a leader did not mean ignoring his own heart. It meant understanding the hearts of the people he hoped to lead. When asked about his choices, Nathaniel did not defend himself with status or authority. He simply said that a future ruler must know the difference between holding power and earning trust. Eliot eventually visited Aurelia again, but this time he did not arrive as someone hoping to be accepted. He arrived as someone who already knew his own worth. Walking through the palace halls, he felt the difference. The place that once represented uncertainty now represented possibility. Nathaniel had not changed because he wanted to win something back. He had changed because he finally understood that love was not something to claim. It was something to respect, protect, and choose every day. The return to Aurelia Palace marked a new chapter for Nathaniel Brooks and Eliot Parker. But both of them understood that returning to the same place did not mean returning to the same relationship. The palace held memories of the past, including moments when Eliot had felt invisible and moments when Nathaniel had allowed pride to guide his choices. This time, however, they walked through those halls with a different understanding of each other. Nathaniel no longer wanted Eliot beside him because tradition expected it. He wanted him there because he finally understood the value of having someone who challenged him to become better. The royal council quickly noticed the difference in the Alpha Prince. Before, Nathaniel had approached every decision with the mindset of protecting the image of the crown. Now, he approached decisions by considering the people affected by them. Some members of the council questioned whether personal feelings could influence a future ruler. They believed that a prince should separate himself from emotions and focus only on duty. Nathaniel listened carefully, but he no longer accepted the idea that compassion was a weakness. He had learned that a leader who ignored the feelings of others could never truly understand the people he served. During a formal meeting inside the palace, Nathaniel spoke openly about the importance of change. He explained that traditions existed to guide people, not to prevent them from growing. His words surprised many because the prince who once avoided difficult conversations was now the person creating them. Eliot watched from a distance, quietly observing the man Nathaniel had become. He saw that the change was not limited to private moments between them. Nathaniel was different with everyone. He treated servants, advisors, and citizens with the same respect. He was no longer searching for approval. He was acting according to what he believed was right. One evening, Eliot and Nathaniel returned to the royal garden where their relationship had reached its most difficult moment. The silver trees stood quietly around them, just as they had before. But this time, the atmosphere was different. There was no uncertainty between them. There was only honesty. "I know I cannot ask you to forget the past," Nathaniel said, "and I do not want you to pretend it never happened. That moment showed me the person I was and the person I needed to become." Eliot looked at him and replied, "The past matters because it shows us what we need to learn. But learning only matters when we continue choosing differently." Nathaniel smiled softly because he understood exactly what Eliot meant. He did not need to prove that he had changed with a single conversation. He needed to continue showing it through every action. For the first time, Eliot felt that Nathaniel was not trying to bring back the relationship they once had. He was creating something new with him, something where neither person had to wait for the other to decide their worth. As the weeks passed, the people of Aurelia began seeing a different future for their prince. Nathaniel was still a royal figure, but he was no longer distant. He was someone who understood that a kingdom was built not only with laws and traditions, but with trust. Eliot realized that the man standing beside him was finally someone who understood the meaning of choice. Love was no longer a promise made because of expectations. It was a decision made freely every single day. The days that followed brought a quiet sense of change throughout Aurelia. Nathaniel Brooks had once believed that becoming a great ruler meant carrying every burden alone, but now he understood that leadership was not about standing above others. It was about understanding them. The lessons he learned from losing Eliot Parker became the foundation of the person he was becoming. Yet even as Nathaniel continued to show his growth, he knew one thing remained unfinished. He had earned the chance to stand beside Elliot again, but he had not yet earned the certainty that Elliot would choose to stay. Nathaniel respected that. He knew trust could not be demanded, especially after the years when Elliot had felt overlooked. Instead of asking for answers, he focused on creating moments where Elliot could see the difference for himself. They spent more time together inside and outside the palace. Sometimes they discussed important matters of the kingdom. Other times, they simply walked through the gardens, shared stories, and enjoyed the peaceful moments they once took for granted. Nathaniel noticed that Elliot was different from before. He was still kind, still thoughtful, but he no longer carried the quiet hope of someone waiting to be accepted. Elliot had become confident in his own identity, and Nathaniel admired that more than anything. One morning, Nathaniel invited Elliot to visit the royal library, a place where they had once spent hours talking about dreams and possibilities. As they walked between the tall shelves filled with ancient books, Nathaniel stopped near a large window overlooking the kingdom. "I used to think the future was something I had to control," Nathaniel said. "I thought every choice had to protect the crown. But now I realize the future is also shaped by the people we choose to value." Elliot looked at him carefully. "And what happens if the person you value does not choose the same future?" Nathaniel paused before answering. "Then I respect that choice. Because loving someone means wanting their happiness, even when you cannot control the outcome." Those words stayed with Elliot because they revealed the biggest change in Nathaniel. The prince who once believed he knew what was best had become someone willing to listen. He was no longer trying to convince Elliot to return to the past. He was accepting the possibility of a future they could create together or separately. That freedom was what made Elliot begin trusting him again. Meanwhile, the royal court slowly accepted that Nathaniel's approach to leadership had changed. He continued honoring the traditions of Aurelia, but he also understood when traditions needed compassion and understanding. The people saw a future king who was not only intelligent and responsible, but also capable of empathy. Elliot noticed that Nathaniel's transformation was not temporary. It appeared in every interaction, every decision, and every moment when Nathaniel chose patience over pride. One evening, as they stood together beneath the silver trees in the royal garden, Elliot finally spoke about the fear he had carried since leaving. "I was afraid that if I returned, I would lose myself again," he admitted. Nathaniel looked at him with sincerity. "Then I promise you this. I will never ask you to become smaller just to fit beside me." For the first time, Elliot felt the weight of the past beginning to disappear. He was not returning to the life he left behind. He was moving toward a new one where he and Nathaniel could stand together as equals. The future was still uncertain, but now uncertainty no longer felt frightening. It felt like a choice they could make together. The morning sun rose over Aurelia, casting a warm golden light across the palace gardens where Nathaniel Brooks and Elliot Parker stood together. For the first time in a long time, the future no longer felt like something waiting to be decided by tradition or expectation. It felt like something they could create through understanding and choice. Nathaniel looked across the garden that had once held one of the most painful moments of his life. The same silver trees stood quietly around them, but the meaning of this place had changed. It was no longer a reminder of what he had lost. It had become a symbol of what he had learned. Nathaniel understood now that love was not proven by promises made during perfect moments. It was proven through patience, honesty, and the willingness to continue choosing someone every day. Elliot had once stood in this same garden hoping that Nathaniel would see him. Now, he stood there knowing that he had always been worthy of being seen. The difference was that Nathaniel had finally learned how to look beyond his own fears and expectations. "There was a time when I thought giving you my place beside me would be a sacrifice," Nathaniel said quietly. "Now I understand that having you beside me was never a burden. It was a gift I failed to appreciate." Elliot listened carefully, remembering the journey that had brought them to this moment. He remembered the uncertainty, the loneliness, and the decision to leave. Those memories would always be part of their story, but they no longer controlled it. "I needed to know that you wanted me," Not because of a promise or a tradition, Elliot replied. I needed to know that you chose me because you truly understood who I was. Nathaniel smiled because he finally understood the importance of those words. He did not want Elliot beside him because of destiny. He wanted Elliot beside him because Elliot was the person who challenged him to become better, the person who reminded him that kindness was not weakness, and the person who showed him that a heart could be both strong and compassionate. The royal court eventually accepted the new direction of Aurelia. The people saw a different kind of leadership in Nathaniel. He remained a prince with responsibilities, but he was no longer a man trapped by expectations. He became someone who valued connection as much as achievement. Elliot also found his place within the kingdom, not as someone defined only by his bond with the prince, but as an individual respected for his own abilities and character. Their future was not built on one person giving up everything for the other. It was built on two people standing together while remaining true to themselves. Years later, Nathaniel would still remember the moment when Elliot walked away. It was the moment that forced him to understand what he had almost lost. But he no longer looked back with only regret. He looked back with gratitude because that moment changed him. It taught him that love could not be held through expectation. It had to be protected through appreciation. And Elliot would always remember that leaving was the choice that helped him find himself again. In the end, their story was not about a prince who finally reclaimed what he lost. It was about a prince who learned that the greatest love was never something to own. It was something to earn, something to respect, and something to choose freely every single day.